So today I'm going to talk a bit about creating layouts for Drupal 8, different techniques in terms of site building. I'll talk a little bit about theming, and I'm going to be talking largely from the perspective of making landing page type layouts. Just as an introduction, I work at Evolving Web in Montreal. My name is Suzanne Dergacheva, and I'm one of the co-founders of Evolving Web, and I work mainly as a themer and a site builder, and I also do a lot of training. So we do have some training coming up in Ottawa the week of September 12th, so if you or someone on your team is trying to get into Drupal 8 and you want to learn theming, module development, site building, we have 5 days of training kind of broken up into 3 parts. So come ask me more if you're interested. So the process of creating layouts on any Drupal site really involves a lot of different parts of Drupal. So often we start off with configuration. We look at blocks and regions often, which is where the theme system and the site building systems kind of meet. There's often a large theming component, especially if you're making a really customized site. And if you're trying to make a site that's not just looking good the day you launch, but also planning for the future, creating layouts, you might also think about applying some kind of design framework so that your site will look good into the future as you add additional components. So when we think about layouts, these days with mobile-first design and a really responsive focus, a lot of sites are looking more and more like one-column websites. Has anyone noticed that? Like you're getting new designs for projects and there's no sidebars anywhere, everything's just all in one column. So we often see designs that look kind of like this, especially for internal kind of content pages. And so the layout isn't actually so complicated. We are focusing more on designing the components as you scroll down on the page, but we don't have to do so much in terms of managing different sidebars or different columns in a grid. But often on a home page, or if you're designing some kind of section landing pages, we do get a lot of columns, and we get different types of grids that we're expected to build into our Drupal site. And we have to think not just about the layout and how we're going to apply the CSS to create the layout, but also about how we're going to get the right content into that layout. Is this a standalone page that we're building, there's only one of them, and we can create all these custom components? Or is this a template for many landing pages that are going to be built out over the lifetime of the site? Or is it a home page that has to be updated by authors and site administrators on a regular basis? Like, does it have to be really flexible? So depending on the content kind of requirements for the landing page, that's going to have a big impact in terms of how you're going to build it. So we'll talk through that during the course of the session. You might also run into pages when you're building a design that are more traditional, so more like the typical content, 2 sidebars kind of layout. And so it's important that whatever system you use for building the layout of your site, that it can accommodate that kind of layout as well. So to start off with, I'm going to talk about configuring different layout components. So I'm going to take this really typical landing page layout. I'm sure we've all seen dozens of websites that have this exact layout with the big banner at the top, some calls to action, some other full width piece of content, and then a bunch of content items in a grid. I'm going to talk about how we could build this, some different configuration options. And then I'll talk more about kind of the theming and design side of things. So to start with, how would we build out these calls to action? So depending on whether it's a home page or an internal kind of landing page, there's different solutions. But typically, any call to action is going to have different field components. So we're usually talking about some kind of title, a snippet of text, probably an image to go in the background, and maybe a link with another custom text that's the actual call to action. So just to look at some examples, you can imagine a page or 3 calls to action like this on a home page. This example comes from the website allseeingalliance.org. So it's 3 audiences that the client defined. And on the home page, we wanted to have these 3 calls to action so that the different audiences could access a landing page that's more specific to their needs. And we actually ended up building this out using views. So because the 3 calls to action are always linking to the same type of content, we could easily define a view to display this content. The 4 fields, the title, the text, the image, the link, those are all pulled from the node that's being linked to. So this was a really easy implementation. You might see calls to action that look more like this. So in this case, you have kind of 3 calls to action to major sections of this university website. Our majors, visit us, tuition and aid. And then you have 3 things that look more like views, I guess, that are linking to relevant content. So you might have calls to action that are kind of interchangeable with other types of blocks. And so in this example, you'd have to have a bit of a more flexible approach to how you're going to configure this. This example comes from the McGill University alumni website. So on their homepage, they have 3 internal calls to action to the global network page, the parents page, the students page. But then they also have this update your info link that links to a different system. So this is not an internal link. So if we were building this out with Drupal, we wouldn't just be able to create a view of content because the first call to action isn't content. We'd need something more flexible. So we'd want to create some kind of reusable component that has the icon, the title, the text, the link, and we'd want to be able to create 4 of them and be able to link on-site or off-site. So translating this into Drupal configuration talk, I'd say the 3 main options I would see for creating calls to action like this would be using paragraphs. How many of you have used paragraphs? Paragraphs is kind of like the new kid on the block. It's really similar to field collections, but it's more flexible and it seems to be a bit more reliable. And so that's one option. Paragraphs allows you to create different paragraph types, which are kind of like mini nodes which you can attach to your content types. So you can attach a paragraph field to a landing page, and that can allow you to reference your individual paragraphs. And then each paragraph can be a call to action. So I can define a paragraph type that has a title, text, link, and image. And then I can use those for all my landing pages. So that's a really flexible option, and it allows me to treat the calls to action kind of like content, like just another field, like nothing really special. Another approach would be block types. So how many of you have used block types in Drupal 8? Or maybe you were using beans in Drupal 7. That was kind of like the pre-block type module. Block types are basically like content types for blocks. So instead of just having a custom block where you can add a title and a body, you can attach all kinds of other fields to your blocks. And you can define different types of blocks. Like you could have an advertisement block that has an image and a link. You could have a video block that lets you display videos as blocks throughout your site, and you just have to put in the video link. Or in this case, we could have a call to action block type that has our image, our text, our title, and our link, and we can place those on our landing pages. And the nice thing about using block types is that it's super flexible, so you can interchange your calls to action with other types of blocks. So if you were trying to build out a page like this and you wanted to intermingle something that's really a call to action with a list, with some lists of content, then block types would be probably a great solution. The one thing about block types, though, is that it's a bit more challenging for your authors and your site administrators because blocks are managed in a different part of the interface. You can't just click edit on your landing page to get to those block types. And then finally, we could maybe build it with views. So depending on what your calls to action are, if you can kind of describe in a view what your list of things is. If I have 3 calls to action, I mean, to me, that just looks like a list. So of course, you can build it with views. And I think like as Drupal site builders, a lot of us probably jumped to views because it's like you can do anything with views, right? So that's always an option as well. So if you do decide to go the paragraph approach, this is kind of what the interface is going to look like when you're editing a landing page. If you attach a paragraph field to the landing page content type, then you get this little mini form within your landing page edit form where you can edit the individual calls to action. Or in this case, I'm calling them landing promos. And one thing that paragraphs gives us that we didn't have with field collections is that with paragraphs, we can have different types of paragraphs that we can reference all from the same landing page field. So for example, if I'm building out a site and I want to have 3 different calls to action on a landing page, but I want to have one call to action that's video-based, and one that has a gallery of images, and one that's just really basic text and an image, then I can attach those 3 paragraph types using the same field. So those are 3 options for my calls to action. Another component that you often want to build out on landing pages, but also just on any page throughout your site, would be a hero section. So hero is kind of like the term people use sometimes for the banner at the top of the page. Often in designs these days, people making them really big, sometimes like basically the full size of your laptop screen. And that banner often has a call to action in it as well. And often it's contextual to the page. So if it's a landing page, it might be built into the content, but you might also have them just on your articles listing page or on a specific article page. You might have this big section at the top with a background image. So again, there's lots of ways to build out this component on your site. And so I'll talk about some options. So just before we get into the configuration, so some examples of hero banners. Sometimes you see banners that have some marketing text. Sometimes they're kind of functional, like this one has some information kind of about where you are in the website and the subsections. Sometimes they're purely marketing, like you just get images and promo text. Sometimes they are very visual, like with a big splash color. This one's from a museum website, so it has also just like the gallery hours. It's kind of like the most important information up there at the top. This one is from the Evolving Web website, so it has not just the title of the page, but also some information about the blog post. And then this one's from a home page. So this one, like, it's a big banner up at the top that kind of looks like it's always there, but if you look a bit closer, you can see it's displaying like latest news kind of information. So sometimes you'll get this kind of content in the hero section. So there's different ways to build this out. Like, it kind of, when in our Drupal 7 minds, we're thinking, okay, if I'm displaying the title of the page, then it's got to be something that's connected to the page title, which is printed out in the page.tpl.php. But in Drupal 8, actually, the page title is just a block. So if we're building out this fancy banner section that includes the page title, maybe we just have to customize that block. You know, maybe we just have to theme it so it looks a bit different. Or maybe if it's a hero section that's reused from page to page, maybe we want to make it its own block. Maybe we want to create a block type for heroes that have the fields that you need, like the background image and the title. Or maybe it's something that you want to create per page using the content from the node you're looking at. So if you're looking at, like in this example, you're looking at an article, you want to show an image from the article, the title, the date, and the author name. Well, what easier tool than views? You can use a contextual filter, and you can build this out using views, right? So that's another option. And then you could just customize the page title template. So that's the approach of just using the existing templates that are used to display the page title and customizing them. So you can have a more configuration approach or a more kind of theming approach. So I would recommend using a block type, again, if you want banners to be reusable. So if you're looking at some kind of truly marketing banner like this, and you're creating this for a landing page, but you're planning ahead and you're thinking, well, I might have to create another landing page with this same banner, then a block type might be a good idea, because then you can configure in blocks or in your context which banner is used. If you're creating something that's more contextual, then definitely a view or just customizing the page title would be a better approach. And if you just have one page, maybe the home page that has a banner like this, then maybe you don't even need a block type. Maybe you just want to use a custom block. So when you're building a page like this and you're setting up the banner, you really have to plan ahead and think not just about the page that you're integrating, but all the future pages that might follow the same design. And so finally, we have content items. So let's say you have some kind of home page, landing page, and you get down to the bottom of the design and there's a grid of news items, or you have like a couple news items on the left and a couple events on the right, and they're all displayed in a grid, right? So this is a really typical thing that we see in designs. And maybe you're showing news or events or a list of people, maybe it's a conference website and you have different people's profiles, or maybe it's a combination of them, and maybe your landing page is twice as long and you have all sorts of content types that have to be displayed in different grids. So you can imagine a grid looking like this, or looking like this, or maybe you have some taxonomy terms you're displaying in a grid like this. And usually when we're displaying grids like this, we're going to jump to using views, which I think is a good, I mean, typically, especially if it's a home page and you're aggregating content from throughout the site, it's really your only option is to use views. There is maybe another option, though, if you have content items that are related to the home page or related to your landing page. You could build this out using fields. So if this is your home page and you want to have 4 featured items, like in this example here with the 4 featured articles, you could have a field on your home page for featured articles and just display those fields in a grid. So that would be maybe another option. And in views in Drupal 8, we have I think we have 4 formatters in views that come with Drupal core. And those are the HTML list, a table, unformatted list, and then we have a grid. And how many of you use the grid format in Drupal 7? Did anyone use that? Just like you needed a grid and you're like, oh yeah, great, there's a grid format. And then you turned it on and it turns out that the grid is actually a table, which means that if you try and resize your screen, it's going to squish all your content. So now the grid in Drupal 8, we can all use it because it doesn't add a table, it adds nice divs. So it's kind of more like the responsive grid module, what that gave us with Drupal 7. So it allows you to define for each of the items, each of the results in your view, what classes you want to add to the columns and rows of your grid. So if you're using a grid system like Bootstrap, and you have classes that you can use to, apply the grid system, you can just put those directly in your views configuration, and you can say, okay, done here, I've got my grid all set up. So that makes it really easy to set up a grid. Or if you're building your theme from scratch, which I'll be talking about at a session this afternoon, how you would do that, then of course you can write your own CSS and add your own classes in there that you're using in your theme. So other side-by-side blocks. So when we're thinking about creating a layout on a site, we're not just talking about calls to action and grids. We also have other components that often need to sit next to each other in a layout. So in this example, we have the logo and menu up at the top and the header. Those are these separate sections that need to sit next to each other. So the one big difference in terms of blocks, well, there's a couple big differences in blocks in Drupal 8, but for themers, a big difference is that everything is a block in Drupal 8. So if you were using Drupal 7 and you opened up the page template, you saw all these regions being displayed, but then you also had like the separate breadcrumbs being printed out and the page title and the logo and the site name. You had all these things that weren't blocks, they were just like theme elements that you had to deal with. So now in Drupal 8, all those things are brought under the umbrella of blocks. So if you open up your blocks layout page, you'll see there's a site branding block for your logo and site name. There's a breadcrumb block. There's a page title block. There's even a tabs block for view, edit, revisions, those management tabs. So you can put those anywhere you want on the page just through configuration. So that's really nice, and it also makes things more consistent for us as themers because it means that we just have to worry about the layout of our regions. So we don't have to treat the logo and the breadcrumbs separately. We just have to say, okay, I'm going to make a region for each part of my layout, and then the blocks can just fit into the regions, and then I'm done. So if you're implementing a design and you're looking at a design like this, you would maybe create a separate region for the left part of the header and the right part of the header, and then you could figure out whether you're using a grid system or you're writing custom CSS, figure out how to get those elements to sit next to each other and work in a responsive way as well. There might be some exceptions. So if you've ever implemented one of those big footers down at the bottom of the site, people often want to have like all the menu items repeated in the footer and they want them to appear in columns. Or sometimes you have a footer block for your contact information and you want the map and the address to sit next to each other. So in that case, you might have more than one column in your layout that appears in this as part of the same block. So you might have one menu block, but you want to have multiple columns. So there's some other ways of dealing with that. You could implement your grid system directly in the block if it's a custom block by adding the markup, adding the CSS classes in the markup of the block. Or you could divide up your menus into separate sections using kind of special menu items and applying CSS to those. So there's some situations where there'll be other components that need to be in a layout that aren't at the level of a region, but almost everything in Drupal 8 you can fit into a region type layout. So some examples of side-by-side blocks. So like obviously in the header, we often have this type of design with the menu and the logo. In the footer, we often have different menus appearing in different columns or contact information. This would be a use case where you might want to use special menu items to break up the menu into columns. Or you might just have like 3 blocks that you want to display in a row. So for this, I would maybe set this up as 3 separate regions. Or I would add a class to blocks in this region to have classes that put them in a 3-column grid. So there's different approaches kind of depending on how you're treating your grids and how consistent your layouts are from page to page. I think the fact that everything's a block does make things a lot easier. So you'll see this if you look at the block configuration. So block-specific classes can be useful. There's the block class module. So if you had some blocks that you wanted to show in a layout like this, you could apply, the block class module allows you to apply classes directly to the blocks. So you could implement your grid system by applying the right classes if that's the approach you're taking. So however you're building your layout, there's going to be some point at which you need the classes in your markup to match the classes that you have in your theme. So there's many approaches to doing this. You can use an existing grid system, either by using a base theme that implements a grid system or by applying the grid system directly, adding the assets to your theme. So obviously Bootstrap is a really popular one. It's all ready for Drupal 8 and a lot of people are using it. So that would be one easy approach to try. How many of you are using Bootstrap on one of your sites? Who's using another grid system? You guys are using Zen. Oh, you're using Zen grids? Oh, cool. Any other? Sorry? WetKit grids, awesome. The old wet, yeah. The ones named after famous Canadians. Any other ones? Any other grids? Anyone made their own grid system? No? No one wants to admit it? In your basement late at night, I'm going to make my own version. So grid systems usually work by giving us a whole bunch of CSS that implements the grid system. So it's got all the CSS we need. The tricky part is usually taking the classes that CSS applies to and getting those into the markup. And in Drupal, this is a bit tricky because some of our markup comes in the form of templates, but some of our markup is added through configuration, like when you're adding a view, or you're adding a block, or you're customizing some kind of content type, and there's classes being added just based on the configuration that we put into Drupal. So the grid, an approach like this is it seems really great, but with Drupal it can be a bit tricky. And that's why we use base themes like Bootstrap, because it makes it easier to add all the classes we need. Bootstrap base theme does a lot of that work for us. Another approach is the Zen grids approach, which doesn't rely on adding a lot of specific classes to your markup. Instead, Zen grids works by providing a set of CSS that you apply by writing more CSS. So it uses Sass, so it comes with existing CSS that's really easy to plug into your own selectors. So you do have to write a layout CSS file, but the file tends to be really simple, and you don't have to worry about messing with all of Drupal's templates and adding a whole ton of classes. You could also write your own CSS. So rather than using all that CSS that Zen Grids or Bootstrap gives you, you can just write your own. And this, might take a little bit more work up front, but has the benefit of you understanding all of the CSS that's being added. And if you're kind of the one in control of the project, it might be your preferred approach. So implementing a grid system, if you go with this approach, you'll probably find documentation, like for Bootstrap, for all the classes that you'll need to use. Even if you're using the Bootstrap base theme, there'll still be lots of places where you have to apply the classes yourself, like in custom twig templates, in your configuration of views, and in your content if you have like a layout within a content block. If you go the approach of writing the CSS yourself, it's worth it to create some generic selectors that you can reuse. So to create a kind of a mini grid system. So rather than having, rather than only using the classes that are provided with whatever theme you're using, to add some classes that you can use to put things into a layout. And that way, if you ever have to create a layout kind of on the fly, it'll become a lot easier to do that through configuration. So it's important with this approach to keep responsive design in mind and to make sure that the set of CSS you come up with works primarily for smaller devices, and then you're only applying the layout on a larger device where a layout makes sense. And one article I would recommend if you go with this approach is from CSS Tricks, Don't Overthink It Grids. It's about creating your own grid system that's just really, really basic and easy to maintain. So one thing to keep in mind, let's see, when you're creating if you're creating the theme yourself and you're implementing the layout all kind of from scratch, is to really do an approach where you're adding the layout just progressively. So with this bit of CSS, you're only adding the layout at a certain width where that makes sense. And this is something that you'll have to adapt as you add content to your site and just continually test with all the combinations of layouts that you have. One technique for adding CSS to your blocks, like I mentioned, is using the block class module. So if you just have 3 blocks in a region and you want to place these next to each other, having a class that you can apply to those blocks is a really powerful tool. Even if you're not using a grid system, you could set up that class in your own custom theme. Or of course, you could just use a selector to indicate which block that you want to style. For example, if they're all in the same region, the highlighted region, maybe you just want to decide that any blocks in the highlighted region are going to be placed next to each other in a grid. But if we're adding CSS like this to our theme, we're really making assumptions about how the configuration and theme work together. So we do need to have some documentation that's going to tell the site builder, hey, if you put blocks into this region, this is going to be the result. You're going to have this layout. So, I think we have the temptation as site builders and themers to just think, okay, we're launching the site. It looks great. The layouts are all working. But of course, people are going to come in and add new blocks and want to expand on the content. So you just have to keep in mind with whatever approach you take to have some documentation in place. So I talked a little bit about adding classes to views. So this is what the interface looks like for views grid in Drupal 8 in core. So we can add classes for our rows and columns. There's a little checkbox for automatic width that you'll see there that's checked off by default. That actually inserts widths into the markup of the page, which is probably not what you want because in that case, it won't be responsive. It's going to apply the grid at whatever screen size you have. So this is what you get just like out of the box, custom theme with 0 CSS, but you've selected the grid and you're using that automatic width checkbox. So it's good for a demo, but it's not good long-term for building a flexible grid. Okay, I'll just move on a bit and talk about one last thing. So I mentioned at the beginning, when we think about layouts, we often think of these really fancy pages like the home page, the section landing pages, pages that are unique, that aggregate a lot of content. But you might have a site that also has some pages with a really standard sidebar layouts content. And so one thing just to note about Drupal 8 is that we no longer get, by default, with core Drupal, the classes that tell us whether there are sidebars on the page. So you know those classes, no sidebars, two sidebars, sidebar first, sidebar second. You guys know what I'm talking about? Yeah, those are gone. So if you're just creating your own theme and you're using the core base themes, then you have to, when you're implementing your layout, decide, do I want to have sidebars? And if I do, they're not going to look like sidebars unless I add some classes to my template. So this is in the html.html.twig template. It's really easy to add classes just based on what regions are appearing on your site. So you'll want to make sure that you do that step, or you're going to be really frustrated trying to use the selectors that you're used to. And then just based on those selectors, it's pretty easy to set up a layout. There's plenty of different techniques for creating a 3-column layout. So finally, just to keep in mind when you're implementing layouts, when you're thinking about a new site, unless the site has a really limited scope, thinking ahead is a really good idea for your future self and maybe your colleagues who you're passing the site off to. So when you're planning out the layout for your site, you want to be thinking about the future. So creating reusable classes for blocks and views, something really to encourage. So if you have a view that has a specific layout that you've applied, it can be frustrating that you can't add a new view easily with the same layout. So creating reusable classes that you apply in the configuration of your view rather than relying on the default classes that views spits out, that's a really good approach for thinking towards the future. Nothing in your theme should be content specific. So if you're designing this great layout and you're relying on all kinds of classes like isFront or a certain node ID or a taxonomy term ID or something like that, that's not very flexible, right? As soon as you maybe delete that content, add new content, or maybe you run a migration and everything's just broken. So try and keep content-specific stuff out of the theme. Create a separate layout.css file. So however you're organizing your CSS, whether you're using Sass, whether you're creating separate layout files for different sizes of screens, just keeping your layout CSS separate so that someone can look at it and try and understand what you're doing in terms of layout. That's a good approach. Kind of deciding what types of layouts and grids your design will allow for. So if you're using a grid system, there might be like many different grids that are possible, but maybe you want to limit those options. So maybe creating some kind of style guide for your site that indicates what kind of grids people can use and what the appropriate classes are. That is a really good step. And then documenting anything that's kind of like special about how your layout works. Like if you put blocks in this region, they're going to go in a layout. That's an important step. The style guide module isn't ready yet for Drupal 8, but creating some sample HTML, some sample Drupal components, and making sure that you're styling those Drupal-specific components, that's an important part of building your theme, although not layout-specific. One last thing I just wanted to add on to this presentation is to talk about panels. How many of you use panels? You hear a session about layouts and landing pages, and I didn't mention panels once. How many of you love panels? So for Drupal 8, the panels modules are all kind of ready to use. So if you're excited about panels and you want to try it for 8, now is a good time to test that out. So you need the panels module. There's the page manager module that's separate, that comes with page manager UI. And then there's another module that you need called layout plugin that allows you to actually build the layout in your panel. And if you're using Bootstrap, there's a fourth module called Bootstrap Layouts that pulls all the different options for Bootstrap layouts and adds those to panels so that when you're building your panels, they can actually be responsive and work with Bootstrap. So I think panels is often overkill. You know, panels allows you to take any page on your site, whether it's a new page or an existing page, and implement a totally different set of regions and block configuration. But often, you know, if you're planning out your site and you're thinking, oh, I really need a flexible interface for my authors, panels is still a great option for that. It makes it harder to implement consistency because it provides so much flexibility, but for certain kinds of pages, it's definitely a good approach. So you could build out, you know, a page with a layout like this, like we were looking at the beginning, very easily with panels. So I think that's all I have for you. Again, the training's coming up in September, so let me know if you're interested in that. And if you have any questions, feel free to shout them out. Is anyone excited about going and using paragraphs?
Oh, yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, so paragraphs for the win. Panels, maybe.
So I love panels, but Drupal 8 is not the template system is so much better than almost. So like we haven't used panels one of our ready, but just because it's much work with it. So we are totally going to the template.
It's also possible to build. It's also possible and very easy to build your custom layouts for panels. So if you do decide to go to the panels route, that's a good option to make sure that the layouts that you put are responsive in the way that you want. Any other comments? You're shy or hungry. You're just thinking about lunch. You're not thinking about any of this. So at the end of the day, if you're still awake at 4 o'clock and you want to talk more about sort of front-end stuff, I'm doing a talk about using base themes. So if you're looking for like an alternative to the Bootstrap approach for everything, there's I'm going to talk about using Classy as a base theme, which is one of the new core base themes in Drupal 8.
Actually, if I can say here, just to like your thoughts. So recently I switched to BAM for Classic. So decided to dump all the Drupal stuff, classes and all stuff. So we're writing our stuff and using BAM and stuff. How do you feel about that? Like if you're grabbing a Drupal site that we're using SAS and all that stuff, and the classes and all that, just all breaks and all that stuff.
So overriding everything?
What's that?
So override, like not using any...
Yeah, we are not letting Drupal output any of the markup or anything. We're still struggling a little bit with the new inline editings. So we're thinking about that. So far, any of the clients in Drupal 8 we don't need for. Actually, it was even better not to have that.
Yeah.
But
I think the one thing that you lose, like by doing a totally custom markup, is that if someone new is coming to your project, they're not going to have that familiarity. Like right now, like if I go and look at any Drupal site, if it's using a lot of the core Drupal stuff, or if it's using a kind of standard theme, then you'll find lots of people who are familiar. But otherwise, I mean, it does work better with a lot of design workflows and allows you to set up a design framework that's very customized. So if you plan it from the start, I mean, it's a great approach. So if you have other questions and you're too shy, come talk to me afterwards. I'll be around. And thanks for coming.